Welcome to our third and final lecture for week 6 as we begin to discuss America abroad from the 1890s through the 1910s. Today we're going to focus on American imperialism and the Spanish-American War. Before I get into lecture today, I just want to issue a friendly reminder to you all that Exam 1, our first test of this course for this semester, is due by the end of the day, literally the end of the day tomorrow. 11:59 p.m. Central Time is the last possible moment that you can upload your completed exam to Safe Assign on Blackboard. So you've got roughly 24 hours, a little over 24 hours from now in order to, before that assignment is due, and you can avoid a late penalty because it would be on time if you get it submitted by 11:59 p.m. Central Time on Monday, March 1st. So with that bit of housekeeping out of the way, let's begin today's lecture. So we talked about the rise of industrial America and the progressive era in the 1890s and the early 1900s. And today is going to be the first lecture in which we really examine and explore American foreign policy, America abroad. And we're going to start by looking at imperialism from the 1890s through the 1910s. So what exactly do I mean when I mention the word imperialism? What does imperialism mean? Well, it's basically when a country, a nation state such as the United States or Great Britain or France, or pick your nation, takes over an independent territory and takes control of it so that the nation state's government, the American government, the British government, what have you, winds up controlling the colony, if you will, this new piece of land. Oftentimes these are colonies that are, or territories that are in what we would call today developing nations. Some people call them third world nations, but they were generally speaking in Latin America and the Caribbean, in Africa, and in some cases in Asia as well. And the common theme with imperialism, not just American imperialism, but imperialism was prevalent during the 19th century and the early 20th century, was that a bunch of industrial, wealthy nations in Western Europe and the United States wound up taking over territories in areas where the majority of the population were non-white. A majority of the population were of Hispanic, Latino descent, or African or Asian, but the common theme is that most of these areas that wind up being colonized by these Western European nations and by the United States during this time period are places where the bulk of the population is black, brown, or yellow-skinned, non-white. And that's one of the main justifications for the white wealthy nations to take control of these areas. There was a racial justification for empire, and that was particularly the case with American imperialism. Rudyard Kipling, a very famous and prominent British author who wrote novels and poetry, throughout the late 19th century and early 20th century. Kipling, most famous perhaps for his novel, The Jungle Book. But Kipling was a white British man who wrote a poem called The White Man's Burden. And that poem basically served as a justification for American imperialism. He was presenting an argument for American imperialism through the poem. Kipling argued that America, like their predominantly white nation counterparts in Europe, had a duty to seize control of developing nations in Africa and Latin America, as well as Asia, which were predominantly non-white. And the overall premise of The White Man's Burden was a belief that these non-white residents of these foreign territories were incapable of progress, incapable of governing themselves, incapable of becoming civilized members of society. And it was thus the duty or the burden of sophisticated white nations in America and Europe to go and conquer these non-white territories in order to civilize the population, the citizenry, if you will, and exert governance over these areas, that these places were incapable of self-governance, so they needed a European nation or the U.S. to govern. So, this was basically, a racial argument, and it was also not unlike the argument that we saw and discussed earlier this semester about American settlers encroaching further and further into the western territories of the U.S. and encroaching on Native American land. The idea that Native Americans were uncivilized, barbaric, savages, and that they needed to be controlled by the white settlers and the white U.S. government. We discussed the ways in which they did that to try to break down Native American culture and divide Native American tribes and sort of a forced assimilation. For example, the boarding schools in which they sent Native American children to and forbade them from speaking in their native language and forced them to speak English, to learn English and speak English, and change their look, their physical appearance, their grooming to look more like Americans of that time period, and also impart the social customs. That was the way that the U.S. did that with Native Americans. And what Kipling is arguing with The White Man's Burden is that the U.S. had a moral duty to do that with these foreign lands full of black and brown, and in some cases yellow skinned populations, the same way that Britain and France, which had established colonies earlier in the 19th century and even before that, as well as even Germany by the late 1880s, had established several protectorates in Africa. So it was sort of time for America to get in on the act in the view of Kipling, and that's what he argued with The White Man's Burden. What else besides Rudyard Kipling's argument? What were some of the other racial justifications for imperialism? Well, during this time period, there was quite a bit of false racial science that what we would now refer to as pseudoscience, because it's been debunked and it's been proven untrue. But back in the late 19th century and early 20th century, these scientific disciplines were accepted in the U.S., and the practitioners of these specific scientific disciplines were considered reputable and respectable doctors and scientists. And these false forms of racial science were used to justify the racial hierarchy prevalent in the United States at the time, and that using that same logic, that would be further reason for the U.S. to colonize other territories outside of its boundaries. One prominent example of this type of false racial science is phrenology. Phrenology, you may or may not have heard of because it hasn't been considered a legitimate science in probably 100 years or 80 to 100 years or so. But it is a type of pseudoscience in which the phrenologists, the doctors within that field, would examine the heads of individuals. Basically, literally put their hand on your skull and feel this size and shape of your head and look for specific bumps on your head, and they would use those physical texture and traits of your skull to come up with a determination as to your level of intelligence and the personality traits that you possessed. You probably might wonder why anybody believed that, but they believed it at that time, that if a reputable phrenologist examined your skull and told you that you were a good person with a kind heart, or you had possessed a superior intellect, that you might take that to be accurate or gospel. But that was very prevalent at the time in the late 19th century and the early 1900s. And phrenologists in general argued that people of color and non-whites were scientifically, they were intellectually inferior to whites, particularly white men. They also believed that women were intellectually inferior to white men as well, and that was sort of par for the course with phrenology during that time. Phrenology and other pseudosciences like it have been thoroughly debunked and are now viewed as illegitimate and kind of relics of the past, if you will. I want to turn your attention now to the image in the upper right-hand corner of this slide. If you take a look at it, it says the white man's burden, pears soap. And basically, this was an advertisement from this era that the white man depicted in there is supposed to be Rudyard Kipling himself. It's supposed to be a drawing of what Kipling looked like, or close enough to what Kipling looked like. But there were companies that ran advertisements, primarily print advertisements that you would see in newspapers and magazines of the era, not just in America, but also in Britain and other Western European nations, but advertisements for products that played on imperialism and basically endorsed imperialism and endorsed the idea that whites from Western Europe and the United States were intellectually superior to the non-white population of what we would now call colonies, developing nations, if you will, and that it was the white man's burden to colonize those regions. And one of the popular companies that advertised was Pears Soap and other soap or detergent type products. It was one of the popular products that would use this type of not so subtle racial undertones in their advertising, basically suggesting that their product was needed to thoroughly wash and scrub these non-white folks that lived in these areas that were target for colonization or were colonized by the European nations. In order to get these people civilized, they had to be clean and properly dressed, and they wouldn't do that on their own because they were incapable of it, or so the argument went. And so you needed Pear's soap or other similar type products of detergent or soap or things of that nature in order to produce a citizenry that was clean and civilized and not dirty and barbaric. So I just wanted to kind of point that out. That's the reason for the image on this slide, because advertising was starting to become very popular in the print form during this time period in newspapers and magazines. So, we talked about the racial justifications for American imperialism with the white man's burden and with false racial sciences such as phrenology. Let's look at the other reasons that proponents of imperialism and expansionists in America argued that the U.S. needed to colonize. Economics, business, greed, avarice, trying to make more money. There were economic justifications for empire, and the U.S. used several of these to justify expansion via imperialism in order to acquire resources. The territories that America sought to acquire during this time period possessed raw materials and natural resources that were coveted by American businessmen, such as rubber and petroleum for heavy industry, and foodstuffs such as sugar and spices were abundant in many of these territories as well. So a new avenue to mine natural resources and raw materials. We talked recently about the conservation effort during the Roosevelt and Taft presidencies and the battle over how public land would be used in the U.S., with Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot arguing that there was limited amount of federal public land, a finite amount of natural resources on federal public land, so that corporations and businesses couldn't have complete control of it in order to preserve the land for American citizens to enjoy on their own and for future generations of businessmen and leaders to use. Well, if you add some colonies through imperialism, you get access to the natural resources and raw materials available there, and you don't have to rely as much on the resources and raw materials prevalent in the federal public land within the United States mainland, if you will. In addition to the raw materials and natural resources, American businesses wanted to sell their products in new markets, particularly in the years after 1893. The Panic of 1893 was a significant economic depression, and Americans, as a result, were purchasing fewer goods and products, and in general, limiting their consumption to only essential items. And so the acquisition of new territories would enable America to gain access to a whole wave of new potential customers for their businesses to sell their wares, sell their products, and it would add an additional source of revenue on to the markets in the U.S., which to a certain degree had become somewhat saturated by products at that point. And you can see in the image on the in the upper right-hand corner of this slide, Uncle Sam, he's crossing over into, I believe it's China, and there are signs greeting him, seeking American products. And you can see that he's carrying a whole bunch of American products in his arms, over his shoulder, and he's looking to unload them over there and sell them over there, find new customers, find a new source of revenue over there. And that was a major reason, a major economic justification for imperialism and empire for America. So, we talked about the reasons and justifications for expansion, colonization, imperialism, and now I want to go into specific examples of territories that America acquired via imperialism, putting imperialism into action, and we'll start by taking a look at Hawaii. So Hawaii in the late 19th century, of course, it was not part of the U.S. officially. It was a territory in the Pacific, populated by Pacific Native Hawaiians, which are basically Pacific Islanders, part of the Asian ethnicity/ethnic descent, Asian descent, and they had a local government, a sovereign government with a king in place. There was also quite a few foreign businessmen living in Hawaii at this time. There were American sugar planters, there were British sugar planters, there were a lot of white sugar planters primarily, but other white businessmen from outside of Hawaii who were living there. But the American sugar planters went to Hawaii to launch sugar plantations. They became known locally as the sugar barons of Hawaii. But in 1890, William McKinley, who at this point was a U.S. congressman from Ohio, McKinley introduced legislation that would put a tariff on foreign goods and in turn protect American businesses and manufacturers from foreign competition. And part of the McKinley tariff was that American sugar planters would receive a 2-cent subsidy per pound of sugar that they produced in America. So the people that were on that had sugar plantations in the U.S., like on the U.S. mainland, would receive 2 cents per pound from the federal government for each pound that they produced, on top of whatever they sold their sugar for. But Hawaii was not part of America. It wasn't an American territory. It wasn't a U.S. state at this point. And so the sugar barons of Hawaii were outraged because they weren't going to be able to cash in on this 2-cent subsidy. And it would be more costly for them to import their sugar into America than it previously had been. So this presents a big economic problem for the American sugar barons. So before we take a look at what the sugar barons did to overcome this problem, want to go back a few years to 1887, 3 years before the McKinley tariff was introduced. The sugar barons had forced Hawaii's king to sign a constitution which significantly weakened his authority. This constitution was known as the Bayonet Constitution because the Hawaiian king was forced to sign the document at gunpoint. And as a result, the sugar barons and the American businessmen gained more control over the local government in Hawaii. The king was basically something of a figurehead as a result of this. But again, the U.S. government did not officially operate in Hawaii at this point. They didn't own Hawaii or have Hawaii as part of their territories or a state. So the king that had signed this constitution died in 1891, and the heiress to the throne was his sister, Queen Leleokalani, who became the Hawaiian queen. And her first order of business was a desire to override and overturn the Bayonet Constitution and enhance the governing power of Hawaii, to make enhance the overall sovereignty of Hawaii, independent of the U.S. So, with Leleokalani now as the Queen of Hawaii, and the McKinley Tariff taking place, the sugar barons are desperate to get the United States to annex Hawaii so that Hawaii can officially become an American territory, and they can benefit from the same economic incentives that their sugar planting counterparts in the U.S. are benefiting from with the McKinley Tariff. So in 1893, the sugar barons get together. They stage a coup to seize control of Hawaii from Queen Leleokalani and take over Hawaii with the U.S. Marines basically forcing her at gunpoint to surrender her position as leader of the Hawaiian government. Now, again, though, the U.S. government does not have authority over Hawaii at this time. And this is taking place right at the end of Benjamin Harrison's presidential term. He'd been defeated by Grover Cleveland. So Grover Cleveland comes into office as the new American president in early 1893. Cleveland is anti-expansionist on his own. He's not really for imperialism, doesn't really have a strong conviction to add colonies to America. Nevertheless, he decides to send an envoy to investigate in Hawaii, sends a special representative of the U.S. government to go to Hawaii and investigate this situation. The envoy, upon arriving in Hawaii and investigating the situation, concludes that the coup was ruthless and immoral, a ruthless and immoral attempt to seize power by the sugar barons, and that their provisional governor or leader, Sanford Dole, who was the son of American missionaries that had settled in Hawaii, that this was a government that really did not deserve the backing of the United States. So Cleveland basically ordered the Marines to stand down. There was no support, not enough support in Congress and to annex Hawaii at this time. And Hawaii remains in limbo for several years from 1893 until 1897. And during this time period, Leleokalani is back as the Queen of Hawaii, but she still doesn't really have the degree of power that she would like. The Bayonet Constitution is still in place. The sugar barons are trying to find a way that they can reclaim control of Hawaii and get Hawaii annexed to the United States. And it's just a very confusing, messy situation for pretty much everybody involved. In 1898, with William McKinley, now the President of the United States and no longer just a congressman from Ohio, McKinley, unlike his predecessor Grover Cleveland, is open to the idea of annexing Hawaii and adding Hawaii to the United States, at least as a territory. He uses the threat of Japanese warships arriving in Hawaii to try to persuade Congress to go along with his annexation proposal, basically arguing that, hey, if we don't annex Hawaii and make Hawaii an American territory, then Japan or China or some other country will seize control of Hawaii, and we will not be able to mine Hawaii's resources. Our sugar planters will probably have to vacate the island. Our warships will probably be forced out of Pearl Harbor. These are all things that McKinley is bringing up to the attention of Congress in his attempt to get them to annex Hawaii. There was a vote in the U.S. Senate on annexation, but it failed to get the necessary 2/3 of senators to vote to ratify a treaty annexing Hawaii. So after that failure in the Senate, McKinley pushed for a joint resolution in the House and the Senate, which only required a simple majority from both houses to pass. The joint resolution did pass, and the United States officially annexed Hawaii in the summer of 1898. Hawaii would remain a U.S. territory until 1959, when it received statehood and became the 50th state. And there is Queen Liliuokalani in the upper right-hand corner of this picture, the last queen, the last monarch of Hawaii, in the picture there. Around the same time that the United States annexed Hawaii in the summer of 1898, I should say, the issue of imperialism in Latin America had come to the forefront, and it resulted in a war, the Spanish-American War of 1898. It centered initially around Cuba. Cuba was a colony of Spain at this time, and for much of the 19th century, Cuba had sought independence from Spain. But the Spanish government refused to grant independence, preferring to retain Cuba as a colony. William McKinley became president in early 1897, and shortly thereafter, in addition to expressing an interest to annex Hawaii, he also expressed an interest in liberating Cuba, if you will, helping Cuba gain independence from Spain. Several of the most powerful newspaper publishers in America at this time, William Randolph Hearst, whose flagship paper was the New York Journal, and Joseph Pulitzer, whose flagship paper was the New York World, they published numerous articles and editorials in their respective newspapers describing the activities of Cuban insurgents and expressing an endorsement of Cuban independence. So it becomes something of a hot-button issue within the pages of America's largest circulation newspapers of this time period, or several of the largest circulation newspapers. In February of 1898, an explosion sunk occurred on the USS Maine and sunk the Maine. The USS Maine was an American battleship which at the time of the explosion was stationed in Havana Harbor off the Cuban coast. 260 U.S. sailors died in this explosion. 84 men, including the ship's captain, survived. The captain, after the explosion occurred, reported that the cause of the explosion was unknown. He could not attribute it as an attack or an act of war from Spain or anybody else. There was no evidence indicating that the ship had been attacked. Yet, these two New York newspapers, the New York Journal and the New York World, both proclaimed that it was an act of war perpetrated by Spain. Teddy Roosevelt, who at this point was serving as the Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Navy under the McKinley administration, he also publicly blamed Spain for the sinking of the Maine, even though there was no evidence to support this assertion. There was a comprehensive investigation much, much later. In fact, it was in the 1970s, so 90 years after the fact. A U.S. investigation revealed that the explosion that occurred on the USS Maine and resulted in the sinking of the ship and all of these deaths of U.S. soldiers, or U.S. sailors, I should say, actually was the result of a fire within the ship's coal bunker, that it was not an attack from Spain or any other foreign country or outside adversary. It was just a malfunction within the ship's coal bunker with a fire that occurred, resulting in a massive explosion and the tragic deaths of so many U.S. sailors. Of course, it didn't matter by the time that this investigation was published. In real time, as it had happened and unfolded in the winter and early spring of 1898, it exacerbated tensions between the U.S. and Spain. So, in late April, America declared war on Spain. The Spanish-American War began. The war lasted just over 4 months. America defeated Spain's warships off the coast of the Philippines, another colony that Spain possessed at that time, and after that they subsequently disposed of Spanish troops in Cuba, which resulted in the conclusion of the war. Of the 274,000 American troops that were called into service in the war, only about 5,500 men died from as a result of the Spanish-American War, but the vast majority of those deaths came as the result of diseases that they contracted in the Caribbean and in these tropical areas. Diseases such as yellow fever, malaria, typhoid, and dysentery. Only fewer than 400 Americans actually died in combat out of the 5,500 total casualties. The war ends with the Treaty of Paris of 1898, in which Spain ceded control of the Cuban independence process to America. America basically facilitated Cuba's process of becoming independent, although interestingly, Cuba did not officially become independent until 1902, 4 years after the Treaty of Paris and the end of the Spanish-American War. In addition, the Treaty of Paris stated that America would receive Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. So America gains these territories, and the annexation of Hawaii had taken place during the middle of the Spanish-American War. So with the acquisition of these three new colonies that had previously been controlled by Spain, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, as well as the annexation of Hawaii, it raises the issue of colonization and empire within the United States. And the U.S., as I mentioned earlier in our discussion, had followed in the footsteps of Britain and France and Spain and Germany and become a colonizer of other areas, other territories. And there was debate as to whether or not this was really what America was supposed to be. American business leaders and Americans that were pro-expansion, pro-colonization argued that the acquisition of these territories, or colonies, if you will, would provide America with significant business and political advantages over other nations. Meanwhile, opponents contended that colonization in pursuit of creating an empire amounted to a drastic departure from the democratic ideals of the nation instituted by America's founding fathers. So in other words, they brought up the founding of America, a former colony of Great Britain that wanted independence, and upon establishing the nation, sort of wrote into the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence the ideal that this would be an independent nation, and there was no mention of seeking colonies to acquire at that time and become an empire like the British controlled at that time. So if you were a critic of expansion and colonization in the late 1890s and the early 1900s, you were likely arguing with your friends, family members, perhaps even local politicians, arguing that colonization and the pursuit of empire was not what the founders intended. It was not what America was supposed to be, and that America had no business getting into colonization and empire. So that's a pretty significant debate. We'll see that debate continue to play out in our discussion of American foreign policy in Tuesday's lecture as we discuss America and the Philippines. But before I conclude today's lecture, I want to bring your attention to the image in the upper right-hand corner of this slide. That is the front page of the New York Journal after the USS Maine was sunk, after the explosion of the Maine. The headline reads, "Destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy." So they're making it very clear. William Randolph Hearst's flagship newspaper making it very clear that they believe this was an act of war perpetrated by an enemy. And you see on the left-hand and right-hand side the announcement of a $50,000 reward for the perpetrator of the Maine outrage, for detection of the perpetrator of the Maine outrage. $50,000 is still a significant amount of money today, but if you go back to 1898, $50,000 in 1898, when adjusted for inflation, is equivalent to just under $1.6 million today. It's equivalent to about $1.575 million in 2021 American money. So that is a very large amount of money for a reward. And that's how serious William Randolph Hearst and his company was in trying to find out what happened with the Maine. They believed it was the work of an enemy. And this is a low period for American media, American journalism. This era is known as yellow journalism, as it appeared that the top publishers and editors at these major newspapers were far more interested in headlines that would sell newspapers and start a war than they were in describing events in an objective manner that was resembling the truth or anything close to the truth. It's referred to as yellow journalism. It's a low point for the journalism industry. And it was a period in which the personal interests of the businessmen who ran these papers took place over what should have been sound and reasonable journalism overseen by the editors and the staff writers and columnists of these newspapers. But that was the era. It was a sensationalistic era of American media. And remember, this is a time before television and radio existed, so there was no cable news, there was no talk radio, there was no nightly news on your broadcast networks. The newspapers were your source of information on events taking place locally in your community during this time period, across the country and internationally as well. So this is basically what rank and file New Yorkers, ordinary New Yorkers, had a chance to read. And if they didn't buy the Journal, they could buy the New York World and see similar discussions there. New York Times also existed at this time, but it's unclear. I don't know that it was the behemoth of a newspaper in terms of circulation and readership at that time that it is today. So anyway, just wanted to point that out and wrap up today's lecture. So I will speak to you again on Tuesday.